Imagine an investment so bad it didn't just bankrupt a company, it erased a country from the map. In the 1690s, Scotland was an independent nation. It had its own parliament, its own king. Well, technically he was also England's king, but we'll get to that. The point is, Scotland was its own country. By 1707, it wasn't. And here's the thing. They didn't lose their sovereignty in a war. They didn't get conquered. They sold it. To cover what was essentially a margin call. This is the story of the Darien scheme, the single worst national investment in recorded history. A story where an entire country looked at a mosquito-infested swamp in Panama and said, yeah, that's our future. What could go wrong? Everything. Everything could go wrong. Let's go back to the 1690s. Scotland is broke. And not like we need to tighten our belts broke. We're talking famine, trade restrictions, and an economy that's basically running on vibes and barley. England, meanwhile, is getting filthy rich. The English East India Company is printing money. English merchants are dominating global trade. English colonies are popping up everywhere. And Scotland? Scotland is watching all of this from the sidelines like a kid with no lunch money watching everyone else eat. So here comes a man named William Paterson. Remember that name. Paterson was a Scottish trader and financial schemer. And I don't use that word lightly, because his previous big idea was helping to found the Bank of England. Yeah, a Scotsman helped create England's central bank and then thought, I should do something for my own country now. Genius, or insane. Probably both. Paterson's pitch was simple and intoxicating. Scotland doesn't need to beg England for trade access. Scotland can build its own trading empire. And the perfect spot? The Isthmus of Panama, a thin strip of land connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Control that, and you control global trade. You become the middleman between two oceans. Every ship, every cargo, every merchant has to go through you. On paper, brilliant. In reality, well, you're about to see why this matters. But first, Scotland needed money. And this is where the story shifts from ambitious to absolutely unhinged. In 1695, the Scottish Parliament created the Company of Scotland trading to Africa and the Indies. Fancy name. The idea was to raise capital from investors across Europe. English investors were interested at first. Some pledged money. But then the English East India Company caught wind of it, and the East India Company did what monopolies do best. They panicked, they lobbied, they threatened. King William III, who, remember, was king of both England and Scotland, sided with England's commercial interests. English investors were pressured to pull out. European investors in Hamburg and Amsterdam were warned off, diplomatically, which is a polite way of saying England told the Dutch and the Germans, invest in Scotland's little project and see what happens to your trade deals with us. So, Scotland was alone, completely financially alone. And here's where a rational nation would have said, okay, we can't fund this, let's scale back. But Scotland did not scale back. Scotland doubled down. Wait, it gets worse. The Company of Scotland went directly to the Scottish people, and the Scottish people lost their minds. In the best possible way if you were selling shares, in the worst possible way if you cared about economic survival. Between 1696 and 1697, Scottish citizens poured roughly £400,000 into the Company of Scotland. Now, £400,000 might not sound like much, but that represented somewhere between a quarter and a half of all the liquid capital in the entire country. Let me say that again. Scotland took up to half of its available cash and bet it on a colony nobody had actually visited. Dukes invested, merchants invested, doctors, lawyers, widows, servants. People mortgaged everything they had. A nation famous for financial prudence, a people whose very stereotype is being careful with money, gambled their entire national wealth on a swamp in Central America they had never seen. Sound familiar? The mania was total. This wasn't just an investment, it was a national identity project. This was Scotland proving it could stand shoulder to shoulder with England. This was pride dressed up as a business plan. 5 ships set sail from the port of Leith in July 1698, 1,200 colonists on board. They carried trade goods, combs, wigs, woolen cloth. woolen cloth. For the tropics, nobody thought to check the weather. They also carried Bibles. Lots of Bibles, because apparently the indigenous people of Panama were just waiting for Scottish missionaries to show up with combs and scripture. The fleet arrived in November 1698 at the Gulf of Darien on the Caribbean coast of what's now Panama. They named their settlement New Caledonia. They built a fort called Fort St. Andrew. They were full of hope. And then reality showed up. Bam! The Paradise trading hub was a dense tropical jungle. Swamps everywhere, humidity that would melt you, and mosquitoes. Millions and millions of mosquitoes carrying malaria and yellow fever. The soil was wrong for farming. The harbor was decent, but there was no existing trade network. No customers, no infrastructure, nothing. The trade goods they brought? Useless. Turns out nobody in tropical Central America wanted Scottish woolen cloth or wigs. The local Kuna people were friendly enough, but they weren't exactly in the market for Presbyterian Bibles. Within weeks, disease started tearing through the colony. Dysentery, malaria, yellow fever. People were dying at a rate of 10 a day. 10 people every single day. The food supplies rotted in the tropical heat. The colonists were eating whatever they could find, which wasn't much. And here's the part that turns this from a tragedy into something darker. They sent word back to Scotland. Sent help, sent supplies, sent ships. And Scotland tried. But England? England issued orders to every English colony in the Caribbean and North America, Jamaica, Barbados, New York, all of them, forbidding them from providing any aid, any trade, any supplies to the Scottish colonists. Their own king ordered them left to die. King William didn't want Scotland to succeed. A successful Scottish colony would threaten English trade dominance. So England didn't just refuse to help, England actively blockaded Scottish rescue efforts. The Spanish, who claimed the territory, were also hostile. Scotland's colonists were trapped between Spanish soldiers, English economic warfare, and diseases they had no medicine for. By June 1699, barely 7 months after landing, the survivors abandoned New Caledonia. Of the roughly 1,200 who sailed out, only a few hundred made it home alive. The rest were dead, buried in a swamp on the other side of the world next to crates of unsold wigs. But here's what makes this story truly insane. Scotland didn't learn. They sent a second expedition. A second wave of colonists arrived in late 1699, not even knowing the first group had already fled. They found the remnants of Fort St. Andrew rotting in the jungle. They tried to rebuild. They tried again. The Spanish attacked. Disease returned. England maintained its blockade. By April 1700, the second expedition collapsed too. The last survivors surrendered to the Spanish and limped home. In total, somewhere around 2,000 Scots died. And the money? The £400,000? Gone. Just gone. Poof. Every penny that widows had scraped together, every merchant's life savings, every duke's fortune bet on the dream of a Scottish empire evaporated in a Panamanian swamp. Scotland was devastated, not just emotionally. Economically, the country was on life support. They'd gambled a quarter to half of their national wealth and lost it all. There was no recovery plan, no bailout, no second chance. And that is when England made its move. See, England had a problem too. Queen Anne, who took the throne in 1702, needed to secure the Scottish border. She needed to make sure Scotland couldn't ally with France. And now, Scotland was so financially broken, it could barely function as a state. So, England offered a deal. The Act of Union, 1707, merged the two parliaments, become one country, Great Britain. And in exchange, England would pay compensation to the Darien investors, a sum called the equivalent, roughly £398,085, plus interest, almost exactly the amount Scotland had lost. Let that sink in. England helped sabotage the Darien scheme. England blocked aid to dying colonists. England pressured European investors to pull out. And then England bought Scotland for the price of Scotland's own failed investment. The plan was never to let Scotland succeed. Scotland's parliament voted to dissolve itself. Not unanimously. Plenty of Scots were furious. Robert Burns, writing decades later, captured the rage perfectly. He called the Scottish nobles who voted for union a parcel of rogues. Many were accused of taking English bribes. Some almost certainly did. An independent nation that had existed for centuries ceased to exist. Not because of invasion, not because of war, because of a bad investment in a swamp. When a nation bets its identity on a financial bubble, sovereignty becomes the price of the bailout. Just like we said, the plan was never to pay it back. It was never even a plan. It was a dream dressed up in a prospectus, sold to a population desperate to believe their country could compete with an empire. And England? England got exactly what it wanted. A united island, no Scottish-French alliance to worry about, access to Scottish soldiers for its wars, and all it cost was, well, Scotland's own money, recycled back to them as a consolation prize. Slow clap. Well done. Now, here's what haunts me about this story. The Darien scheme has every element of every financial disaster that came after it. The South Sea bubble, the Mississippi scheme, the dot-com crash, the 2008 mortgage crisis. Every single one follows the same playbook. A seductive idea nobody stress tests. National mania that drowns out skeptics. Money pouring in from people who can't afford to lose it. Powerful interests working behind the scenes. And when it all collapses, the little people pay. Always. The Scots who invested in Darien weren't stupid. They were desperate and proud. They wanted their country to matter on the world stage. And someone handed them a beautiful story about how it could happen, wrapped in just enough plausibility to feel real. And they believed it, because they needed to. Humans don't change. That's why finance never learns. 300 years later, people still pour their savings into things they don't understand, in places they've never been, because someone with a confident voice told them it was a sure thing. The only difference is, we do it with apps now instead of sailing ships. And as usual, nobody learned anything. Most people will scroll past this and forget it by tomorrow. They'll keep chasing the next sure thing, the next guaranteed return, the next dream dressed up as an investment. The Scots forgot to ask one simple question. Has anyone actually been to this swamp? Maybe next time, ask. But if you'd rather see these disasters coming instead of living through them, the subscribe button is right there. This is Money Never Learns. And neither do we.